At 05:21 hours local time, inside the guarded anchorage at Kerch Naval Base on the Crimean Peninsula, two ships sat motionless in water Russia treated as its own. Volga and Vyatka, cable-laying vessels of Project 15310. On paper, they were quiet support ships. In practice, they were among the most valuable assets in the entire Black Sea Fleet, the platforms that laid the cables feeding the Garmonia hydroacoustic network that let Russia listen for submarines across the whole sea and wire Crimea into its undersea nerve system. Losing them would not cost Russia a warship. It would cost Russia an ear. The fleet commander believed this corner of Kerch was the safest square on the board. He did not know that Ukraine had already set a trap in 3 layers: 14 An-196 Lyutyy drones, 6 Magura V5 drones, and a screen of decoys, closing in from 3 directions at once. And here was the irony. The sophisticated ships built to hunt submarines were about to be gutted by uncrewed boats cheaper than the missiles Russia would fire to stop them. In the next 15 minutes, Kerch would stop being a fortress and start becoming a lesson. At 05:31 hours local time, 10 minutes after the first drones slipped past the horizon, the alarm finally reached the fleet command post overlooking the Kerch Strait. On the coastal Neva radar, the duty crew counted 6 contacts pushing in from 50 miles out, 3 of them sharp and confident, 3 flickering in and out of the wave clutter and morning fog. They were fast and they were coming from the sea. After the uncrewed boat raids of the previous winter, no Russian watch officer treated a surface contact as background noise anymore. The order to engage went out within seconds. The nearest shield was a Pantsir-M battery dug in beside the anchorage. On paper, it was exactly the right weapon for this fight. A short-range point defense system built to swat down drones, cruise missiles, and anything skimming low, pairing a tracking radar with 12 ready 5.7E6 missiles that leave the tube above Mach 3, and a pair of 2 A-38M cannons that throw 30mm rounds at 5,000 a minute. Against a handful of slow boats, the math looked trivial. The radar locked and 4 missiles ripped out into the fog. 3 of them found their marks. Proximity fuses flashed a dozen feet from the hulls, and 3 Magura V5 boats came apart in bright orange blooms on the water. The 4th missile chased the faint cluster of signals and detonated inside it, against nothing but a shadow. Because those first 3 boats had never carried warheads, they were the pieces Ukraine had pushed forward to be taken. Decoys tuned to shine brightly on Russian screens, one of them dragging a jammer that painted a false swarm exactly where the real, warhead-heavy boats were slipping through behind it. Russia had just spent 4 missiles knocking over pawns, and the trap folded open a second time. As the decoys died, they gave up something the Russians had not counted on. Tucked inside the 2 jammer boats were 8 FPV drones, released in the final seconds before the hulls tore apart. They scattered low across the swells, switched on their own emitters, and littered the Pantsir screen with dozens of ghost returns. The battery that had been hunting boats was suddenly hunting a cloud. Its search radar strained to sort the real from the false, feeding target after target to the fire control channel while the commander made the only move the system left him: fire. More 5.7E6 leapt out. The 2 A-38M cannons swung down and hammered the sea into a wall of tracer, tearing the FPVs apart one by one. It worked. Almost every ghost was cleared. But that was the point. In under 3 minutes, the Pantsir S-1 had burned through missiles and cannon belts to win a fight that was never the real one. And behind the smoke it had made, 3 loaded Magura V, 5, and 14. An-196 Lyutyy were still closing on Kerch. By 05:48 hours local time, the main spearhead had closed to within 20 miles of the Kerch Strait, and Russia's most patient defensive layer finally showed its hand. This was not a gun or a missile. It was Pole 21, an electronic warfare grid whose R340RP modules sat bolted to telecommunications masts and high towers all around the strait, turning the sky into a cage roughly 35 miles across. Pole 21 never needed to see a single drone. It went after the one thing every drone in that swarm depended on to know where it was: the faint satellite signals feeding down from GPS, Galileo, and Beidou. Those signals arrive at the surface already weak, so a strong transmitter close by does not have to destroy them. It only has to shout louder. And for a few seconds, it worked. On the Ukrainian control screens, position data began to lie. Coordinates jumped sideways, headings drifted off the approach corridor, altitude and speed readouts stopped agreeing with one another. For aircraft skimming the sea at 200 feet, that kind of confusion is not an inconvenience. It is a death sentence written in milliseconds. The two lead An-196 Lyutyy never made the switch in time. They flew straight into the densest part of the jamming, lost their reference for several seconds, and began drifting apart from the formation. One banked hard left. The other tried to hold its line, but chased a false position its receiver now believed was real. The gap between them collapsed faster than either could correct, and they slammed together in midair, folding into a single brief fireball against the gray fog. Russia watched two pieces come off the board and believed the spearhead was breaking. It was the wrong read. The other 12 Lyutyy had been built for exactly this square of the game. The instant the jamming alarm turned red, each onboard computer stopped trusting the corrupted satellite feed and handed control to its inertial navigation system. From that moment, the drone no longer asked the sky where it was. It worked the answer out for itself, from heading, speed, acceleration, and a cluster of ultra-sensitive gyroscopes buried in the fuselage. At the same time, terrain matching came alive. Cameras and sensors under each belly began reading the surface sliding past below. The shape of the coastline, the dark seams of water, the piers and structures loaded into memory before launch, and comparing it against the stored map, nudging the flight path back onto the corridor a fraction at a time. That was the flaw at the heart of Pole 21. It could blind every satellite over the Kerch Strait, but it could not reach inside a drone that had already memorized the way in. It could not move the coastline. It could not shift the anchorage. One by one, the Lyutyy dropped lower, hugged the swells, and kept coming, flying now by inertia, by terrain, and by a route learned by heart. The layer meant to erase them had only cost Russia 2 aircraft it did not fire a shot to kill. At 05:52 hours local time, with Pole 21 bypassed and its jamming corridor already falling behind the swarm, Russia reached for the one card it had not yet played, its own attack drones. From the airfield at Kerch, 2 groups of Lancet loitering munitions lifted into the pre-dawn haze, one after the other. The first, 3 aircraft, went low over the water to hunt the surviving Magura V5. The second, a heavier pack of 10, climbed onto the tails of the 12 An-196 Lyutyy that had just torn through the electronic cage. The Lancet was built for exactly this kind of kill. It is a loitering munition, a small, cheap, camera-guided drone that circles until an operator marks a target, then folds into a dive and drives itself home. Against a slow, predictable aircraft, it is close to ideal. A quiet electro-optical seeker, no radar for the enemy to trip over, and a warhead sized precisely to gut a drone or a light vehicle. On the board, Russia had just brought a piece into play that could reach across several ranks and take almost at will. And for a moment it did. One Lancet from the sea hunting group tipped over and drove into the hull of a Magura V5, throwing a column of fire and water 90 feet above the surface. 2 more slid in behind the lead Lyutyy on a shallow diagonal, and 2 fireballs bloomed almost together against the gray sky. One aircraft snapping in half and spinning into the sea, the other losing a wing and cartwheeling down to burst on the waves. Piece for piece, the trade was running Russia's way. But a loitering munition lives and dies on a single number, and that number was speed. The Lancet cruises at roughly 80 miles an hour. Patient, economical, lethal against anything slower than itself. The Lyutyy, once its operators pushed the throttle to the stop, could hold 120. That gap sounds like nothing until it becomes a stern chase, where every second the faster aircraft pulls a little further out of reach and the hunter burns irreplaceable fuel just to keep the range from opening. A Lancet that spends its endurance chasing something it cannot catch is a Lancet that will never find its way back. The Ukrainian control crew read that arithmetic first. The order went out at once. Full power, spread wide, break the pursuit. Engines opened up. One by one, the Lyutyy shed their tight column and fanned onto separate headings, forcing each Lancet to commit to a single tail and give up all the others. The distance began to stretch. After a few minutes, the chase had turned into a losing race, and the Russian commander saw it clearly. Fly his loitering munitions any further, and they would simply strand themselves over open water. He pulled the 8 survivors back toward base and pushed a warning out across the defensive net around Crimea and Krasnodar. He had taken his pieces, but the swarm he was trying to break had only been scattered, and scattering it had dragged it off the very line that pointed at Kerch, buying Russia not a win, but a handful of extra minutes. At 05:58 hours local time, 8 An-196 Lyutyy and 2 Magura V5 boats reconverged onto their attack lines, folding back toward Kerch, while Russian eyes were still fixed on the drones the Lancets had scattered. Only one shield stood between them and the anchorage now. A Karakurt-class missile corvette guarding the moorings, and at this range it was firing almost point blank. This was the endgame square, the one piece Russia had left on the board, and it was worth understanding what that piece could do. The Karakurt carries a vertical launch cell for reach and closer in, a Pantsir-M, the naval version of the same point defense family, marrying surface-to-air missiles to a pair of AO-18KD rotary cannons that spit 30mm rounds at 10,000 a minute. In theory, nothing small and slow crosses the last mile in front of that ship and lives. The cells opened first. 2 missiles rose off the deck, tipped toward the formation, and took 2 Lyutyy in a pair of black smears against the gray. But Ukraine had already decided how this square would be played. 2 more drones climbed deliberately, offering themselves high where radar wanted to look, while 4 dropped to the wave tops to hide the true vector. The 2 Magura V5 running in at sea level. The Pantsir-M answered the bait. Its missiles reached up and tore the 2 climbing decoys apart, and for a heartbeat, the Corvette believed it was winning. It had taken the wrong pieces. Then the boats and the low drones entered the close-range envelope, and there was no time left for missiles. The AO-18KD cannons swung down and opened up, laying a wall of tracer across the water in front of the bow. 1 Magura V5 drove straight into it. 30 rounds walked through its hull and warhead compartment, and its 700-pound charge went off on the surface, throwing a column of fire and water 75 feet into the air and slamming steam and smoke back across the Corvette's forward deck. In that blindness, the guns kept sweeping, and 1 more Lyutyy caught a burst in the wing and cartwheeled into the sea. But the survivors had already split. 1 climbing to pull the barrels up, 2 more hugging the water beside the last boat. The cannons could not hold the sky and the sea at once. Forced to choose, they chose up. And in the few seconds the muzzles were tilted at 60 degrees, the gap opened. Through it came the last Magura V5 and 2 and 196 Lyutyy, with the Bayraktar TB2 overhead feeding the final numbers, approach angle, anchorage position, the soft points near the waterline, straight down to Odessa. The boat pressed flat to the surface and drove into the starboard side of Volga, low, right at the waterline, the worst place a moored ship can be struck. When the 700-pound warhead detonated, the temperature at the core of the blast ran past 2,500 degrees Celsius. The shockwave tore plating away from a technical compartment and drove tons of seawater in behind it like a hammer. The deck buckled. The auxiliary power shorted and went dark. Water began climbing into the lower spaces. 3 seconds behind it, the 2 Lyutyy took Vyatka from 2 angles at once. The first drove into the afterdeck, into the cable-laying gear and winches, splitting the technical deck into a long strip of fire. The second climbed the superstructure and struck the antenna cluster and the mission control compartment, snapping masts, blowing in the command windows, killing the ship's eyes and voice in a single blast. Inside the most protected water in Kerch, 2 of Russia's rarest ships had just become 2 burning masses of steel. The cost of that morning was not written only in the smoke drifting over the anchorage. Militarily, Volga sat listing at her moorings, holed at the waterline, seawater still climbing through compartments never built to be flooded. A hull that might be saved, but would not lay another cable for a long time. Vyatka had lost her afterdeck to fire and her superstructure to the second drone. No antennas, no sensors, no mission control room, only a burning shell that could neither see nor speak. And these were not warships Russia could pull replacements from a reserve line. They were rare, specialized platforms packed with winches, undersea gear, and electronics that sanctions have made slow and expensive to rebuild. Every month they spend out of service is a month the Black Sea Fleet listens to the deep with one ear. Strategically, the strike aimed past the two ships at the thing that held them together. Ukraine is no longer hunting individual targets in Crimea. It is dismantling the ecosystem that lets Russia keep the peninsula alive. The ports, the ferries, the Kerch Bridge, the radar, the air defense, and now the quiet vessels that wire the seabed. Pull enough of those threads, and Crimea stops being a fortress and becomes a burden, a rear area that has to be defended every hour instead of trusted. That is the sharpest lesson of Kerch. Russia won nearly every duel that morning. Each missile, each cannon burst, each Lancet found its mark, and still lost the board. Because the game was never about any single piece. Kerch is no longer the untouchable square Moscow believed it to be. What do you think mattered more here? The two ships Russia lost, or the shock of watching its strongest anchorage pierced with the fleet looking on? Leave a comment below. If you believe Ukraine deserves peace, sovereignty, and a just end to this war, subscribe and follow along to see which link gets struck next.